And welcome back to our next edition of the CBB Review Studio podcast. I am Dan Siegel, joined today by my co-hosts Matt Mlodzinski and Ben Anderson. We are here with part two of our reviewing of the past recruiting classes. We are going to look at 2018 and the top 25 there, just what these guys are up to nowadays, what they did in their college careers, what they have done in their professional careers since, and what the latest is on them, whether they panned out to their top 25 recruiting status, because a lot of them did, but there's definitely a decent amount that we're going to look at these guys' names and we're going to be like, I haven't thought about that guy in several years. So let's get right to it. We've got number 25, Kobe White, and I believe that is Matt that's going to be talking about him.
Yeah, I mean, Kobe White, to me, first off, definitely a boom if we're talking about, booms or bust on this list. I mean, only 1 year in North Carolina, certainly, a five-star, but a fringe five-star at that. So could have been a guy that's had to stay a second year, but he really only needed the 1 year at Carolina, of course, drafted by Chicago, and he's honestly been a hit with the Bulls. I mean, I know the Bulls haven't been the best NBA team over the past couple years, and Kobe White, obviously hasn't been a star that's brought them over the top, but he really hasn't had that chance. I mean, this is a team that's been trying to play off of their veterans like Zach LaVine, DeMar DeRozan, just didn't really work out the way they wanted it to. But you look at his numbers this year, career high 19.1 points a game, 5.1 assists, 4.5 rebounds. Kobe White is entering, he's not entering a contract year. He's under contract for a couple more years, but he's entering that territory when he is up for his next contract. I think he could get a pretty big contract with either staying with Chicago or going elsewhere. So to me, he's a boom because he's really set himself up for some long-term success.
And then number 24, Ben, take us away.
Yeah, so Jalen Horde was a bit of a late bloomer. He was out of France, and he signed with Wake Forest and surprisingly left after one season. It wasn't necessarily what everyone anticipated in terms of the NBA draft. He did go undrafted and bounced around for a couple of years in the G League before ending up in Israel and Tel Aviv with the team there. I think that looking back from a college perspective, there was a lot of unfinished business in terms of his potential with Wake Forest specifically. I think that the fact that Danny Manning's tenure had sort of gone downhill at that point probably played a little bit of a factor in him moving on as quickly as he did. And he definitely has a lot of tools to be able to succeed. We just never saw it really all put together. He had a good year, of course. He averaged 13.7 rebounds, but I think showing that he did go undrafted in the draft, I think having another year like a couple of other players we're going to talk about a little bit later on in the rankings might have done a lot of good for him moving forward in terms of his NBA prospects overall.
And then number 23, you guys just talked about guys that left college very early. Andrew Nembhard is the guy that solidified himself with a very productive college career for 4 years, 2 years at two respective schools. Started at Florida, and he was then running the point for the next 2 years at Gonzaga for a couple of those really loaded teams. I mean, I think his first year at Gonzaga was the year that they nearly had that undefeated season, then lost to Baylor in the finals. But like, he was coming off the bench for that team, and that's nothing about Nembhard. That's more about Gonzaga. But he was a very good college player, then was drafted 31st overall by the Pacers. And since then, he's kind of just been a productive role player, right? He's a fringe starter, starts some games, comes off the bench some games for a good Pacers team. I mean, obviously, Matt, you remember this very well, the buzzer beater that he hit in the Knicks series. Knicks would have gone up 3-0, but instead it became 2-1 in that series, and obviously the Pacers went on to win that series. So that's kind of his legacy right now, but definitely a boom. Andrew Nembhard, very good college player, solid NBA player. That's all you could ask for.
Yeah, and I'm moving on to Emmanuel quickly. I feel like I've gotten the best players so far if you talk about NBA guys with Kobe White and then Emmanuel quickly. A guy who I kind of forgot he had to stay 2 years at Kentucky. Like, he really didn't put up a lot of numbers his freshman year. Stayed as a sophomore. That really got him drafted, of course, with the New York Knicks. Almost won Sixth Man of the Year, in my opinion. Should have won Sixth Man of the Year 2 years ago. And then a bit of a surprise. I mean, he was always under trade rumors, but now he's with Toronto. kind of, way too early to see what's going to happen with Emmanuel Quickly, right? I mean, it's been half a year with Toronto, maybe a little bit over half a year. Going to have to wait and see, especially with all the changes that they've made besides trading for him and RJ Barrett as well. But he is a restricted free agent. So it'll be interesting to see what exactly happens with Quickly, type of contract he gets, if he'll be on the move, what Toronto wants to do with him. There's going to be a lot of kind of guesses there with Emmanuel Quickly. But I think it goes without being said that he is still a top young star in this game. I mean, all these guys are still very young. None of these guys are even close to their prime yet, probably at the closest, maybe 2-3 years away from their prime. And Emmanuel Quickly is certainly one of the best on this list.
Yeah, absolutely. I can take it over for number 21 with Devon Dotson now. And similar to my first player on the list, if you look at their Wikipedia page and you look at their professional career, they look kind of similar. They bounced around. Dotson bounced around for a couple of years in the G League before eventually ending up in Spain's top league, where he's still currently playing. But the difference is, I do feel like Dotson really maxed out his potential at the college level. He did only stay for 2 years, but he started every single game he played for Kansas, which is very impressive, especially as a freshman. And he averaged 18 points a game during his sophomore year. I think if you look at Dotson, it's more of his frame comparative to the NBA that really limited his potential when we're talking about the pro league. He's only 6'1". He's not super strong, super quick, but he was a very effective college player, and I think that's what most fans will probably remember him for. He was on some really good Kansas teams, took over, like I said, starting duties from players like Frank Mason, where you've always had a legacy of really good guards under Bill Self and the Jayhawks. And while it didn't work out in the pros necessarily, I still think he had a really good college career.
And then we move on to number 20, Louis King, who went to Oregon, had a good year. He won Pac-12 Freshman of the Year, but he was kind of banged up with injuries, didn't really amount to his full potential, in my opinion. He was a one and done guy, but he did not get drafted in that following 2019 NBA draft. And then he's been playing on two-way contracts for a few years. I looked it up. He only ended up playing 27 career NBA games. So just kind of been bouncing around different minor league systems. Most recently, he's played for he spent his most recent season in the Crios de Cuguas of the Baloncesto Superior Nacional in Puerto Rico.
Dude, that's one of the best leagues. How do you not know that name?
Yeah, I'm a little disappointed in myself having taken Spanish for 5 years and not being able to get that. But yeah, I'm considering that a bust.
Yeah, you go from one bust to another bust in Jordan Brown. Didn't play for any names that are too hard to pronounce, but this is a jumble of teams that Jordan Brown played for throughout college. Started his career at Nevada, went on to Arizona, where, mind you, he was the sixth man of the year in the Pac-12. So I'm kind of confused why he didn't end up staying in Arizona. He also had to sit out a year in between them. This was before transfers could just go wherever, whenever they wanted, but he still went wherever he wanted because then he went to Louisiana. He was first team All-Sun Belt at Louisiana. So Jordan Brown, still was playing well and then decides to go to Memphis last year. And just, I mean, this guy played for 4 different schools from 2018 until last year. So who knows what's going to happen with Jordan Brown in the future. Kind of crazy that we're talking about a 2018 top recruit who was still in college basketball this past season. But you know what? That's the state of college athletics. He put up some good numbers in college, so that's what I'll say. But, you kind of got to go with a bust here because you're a top 20 recruit and, you just kind of went all over the place. You were never able to stay anywhere. If we're talking about a lengthy college career, sure, he wasn't a total bust, but I mean, when you're a top 20 guy, people are thinking NBA outlooks. They're not thinking 2 years at Louisiana.
Yeah, sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum is this next player, Naz Reid, who went one and done at LSU. He had good numbers for sure. He's averaged 13 and 7, but he went undrafted in the NBA draft in 2019. And this is one of the best success stories, in my opinion, of the entire top 25 that we're going to be looking at today, because he really worked his way up all the way from signing a 2-way contract out of college with the Timberwolves to being a key reserve on a team that went to the Western Conference Finals, and he won the Sixth Man of the Year this past season. He's a fan favorite in Minnesota. Everyone knows his name. If you hear Nas Reed chants, right, while you're watching a Timberwolves game, he's definitely one of the most popular players on the team, and for good reason. He really has worked his way up. He averaged 11.4 points during the playoffs this season, or 11.1, excuse me. He averaged 13.5 points and 5 rebounds a game during the regular season as well. He had signed a 3-year extension, a 3-year $42 million contract that puts him through 2025. So it does seem like he's going to be with the Timberwolves for at least a couple of more years, and we'll see what his value looks like after that contract fills up. But really, after going undrafted and after 1 year of college, this has to be considered a success story overall.
Number 17, we got Darius Bazley, who this was a guy out of high school. Like, he was a famous high school recruit at least in the basketball world. You know, McDonald's All-American, all the accolades. And then kind of was all over the place in his first year out of high school. I see Matt shaking his head because he was originally expected to play for the Syracuse Orange, for Jim Boeheim, then ended up announcing he was going to go directly to the G Leagues, then decided he wasn't going to do that, and he decided to just take the entire season off the train on his own. But after all that, he did end up being drafted number 23rd overall. And he did have a couple of decent years as well with OKC, but it's kind of flamed out since. I think the most recent thing that happened with him, he received a contract with the Jazz, and for the last 6 games of the season, he played in Utah and got some minutes in garbage time and whatnot. Yeah, he did have some amounts of an NBA career, so he's, I guess, well off financially, but like for the recruit he was and not really having much of a legacy to leave behind at either of the levels, I'm going to call him a bust.
Yeah, Jalen Smith, I'm kind of in between on. Sticks, as people like to call him. I wouldn't go as far as a bust as Darius Bazley. But again, Smith, 2 years at Maryland. I feel like people really knew him at Maryland. Like, he was probably one of the last good Maryland players, because since Kevin Willard took over, it hasn't been like probably what the Terps have wanted. I know they made the tournament a couple years ago, but they're really waiting for, especially this year, Derek Queen to become, even better than Jalen Smith was. But Jalen Smith was still a really good player, for the Terps. It's just in the NBA, like, I don't want to say he's kind of fizzled out, but I feel like he got some, this guy was drafted 10th overall by the Suns. So we're kind of looking at a guy who you're figuring is maybe going to be a solid player in the NBA. He's turned into a solid role player. I'll say that. I mean, he's averaged like 8 points, 5 rebounds throughout his NBA career. There's no shame in that. So I'm not calling him a bust by any means, but I feel like when you're picked in the top 10, you're kind of expected to do more by now if you're going to be what people thought you were, if that makes sense. And right now, Jalen Smith isn't showing that he's going to be much more than what he is already. I mean, he's not going to turn into a 15-point-per-game scorer. I'd be really shocked if that happened overnight. Maybe he'll surprise me, but, he's on the Pacers now. He puts up some numbers, and, we'll see where it goes from there.
All right, moving on to number 15. This is actually the first player I drew to talk about that has been drafted so far, so I'm excited for that. This is Trey Jones out of Duke, and this is the first of 4 mega stars, you could say, that Duke had in this recruiting class. We're going to cover the next 3 later on in the episode. But Trey Jones had a very successful college career, in my opinion. I think in following his brother's footsteps, Tyus, he never did win the national championship like Tyus did, but he stayed for 2 years at Duke. He had a really nice sophomore season that elevated him into the 41st pick overall in the NBA draft for the Spurs. And he has re-signed since then in 2023 and has had a really solid season, especially for a second-round draft pick where, everyone knows that nothing is guaranteed for those second-round picks. So to be able to have started 68 games and 49 games over the past 2 seasons for the Spurs, average double-digit points and 6 assists per game, I think you have to be happy with the career he's having so far. Now, for a top 15 recruit, maybe that's not exactly what you envision. Maybe you envision being, a little bit more of an impact player in the NBA, but realistically, there are only so many spots in the league for guys like Trey Jones. He's only 6'2", only 175. He's not the biggest guy in the world, doesn't have the most physical attributes that teams are looking for necessarily, but the guy can play ball. And I think that Greg Popovich and the Spurs have picked up a really nice piece to build around, either as a starting or a backup point guard for the future, including Wemby.
Number 14, Darius Garland, a guy who we're a CBB podcast. It's like a little unfortunate what happened with him. He was committed to Vanderbilt. He was the highest recruit ever there. He played 5 like awesome games for Vanderbilt, was very good. One of them, he put up 32 points. Then he got hurt and missed the rest of the season. But for his NBA future, everything was perfectly fine. He was drafted number 5 overall by Cleveland in that 2019 class that has a bunch of other guys that we'll talk about, and has panned out. Basically, it's everything that they would have hoped he would pan out to at number 5 overall. Made an all-star game in 21 to 22. The following season, he averaged 22 and 8. Like, he's just been putting up numbers. Very good NBA player. Absolutely a boom.
Well, the next player didn't choose to go to Vanderbilt, but he did go to another SEC team. That's Keldon Johnson. Certainly a boom. One and done at Kentucky. Makes it to the NBA, drafted by the Spurs. Actually spent a little bit of time in the G League, and it's clear he did not need it because Keldon Johnson has been one of the top players on this young Spurs team. We'll see where this franchise goes from here because it is so young with Wemby and all the guys in San Antonio. But you're talking about a guy who averages career high 22 points in 2022-23. Actually dipped down a bit this year, which is, again, expected when you get a guy like Victor Wembanyama. Your previous star is just going to have to take the back seat when you get a guy like that first overall. But Keldon Johnson, if he is a part of the future of the Spurs, I think the Spurs are in good hands. If he's not, some team is going to get a potential future All-Star. I mean, this guy has future All-Star written all over him. I don't know if he's going to be an All-Star every single year in the NBA throughout his prime, but he's shown over the past really 2 to 3 years that he can be a consistent scorer at the small forward position. And I mean, what's not to love about this guy's game?
Yeah, staying in the Bluegrass State and staying with John Calipari, we have another Kentucky player at number 12, which is Ashton Hagans. For being the number 12 overall player, I think for his career, you have to consider him a bust, but that's not necessarily how I remember him as a college player. I thought he was actually quite good, especially on the defensive end. He won SEC co-defensive player of the year his freshman season after having the 3rd most steals in Kentucky history for a freshman behind only John Wall and Rajon Rondo. So in good company at the top there. And then he was named to the all-defensive team again his sophomore year. He did go undrafted and he's bounced around in the G League for the past few years. He's currently on a 2-way contract with the Portland Trailblazers right now. But he, I think, maxed out what he could be. Again, I know I sound like a broken record sometimes when I'm saying that, but I felt like he maxed out who he could be at the college level, especially playing for a team like Kentucky where you don't necessarily see the outsized statistics on those Kentucky teams, especially during that era where they're pretty loaded with a lot of talent that they were trying to, balance minutes and stuff like that. So I think Hagans was a good college player. Obviously, the number 12 pick does not want to be on the number 12 overall recruit in a high school class doesn't want to be on a 2-way contract 3 years into his career. But I think it's just a sign more of how competitive the NBA is than anything else.
And then we move on to number 11, Simi Shittu, a guy who also went to Vanderbilt, 2 Vandy guys in a row. And for me, and he had kind of an underwhelming single season that he spent at Vanderbilt. He wasn't like injured like Garland was, because Garland had like those awesome couple games, then got hurt. This guy he was not terrible, but he didn't perform the same way everyone expected him to. And he ended up declaring, but not getting drafted. I think at a high school, his draft stock was really high. And then people were kind of disappointed by his single college season. And since then, he's just bounced around a bunch of minor league organizations, originally G League, and now playing overseas. Right now, he is playing for, I got this, Matt, the Kolossos Radu in Greece. And I'm considering him a bust.
Excellent pronunciation there. I'll switch this over to the next slide. We're in the top 10 now. And another former New York Knick for myself, so I feel blessed to be able to talk about Quentin Grimes, who started his career at Kansas, went to Houston before Houston was in the Big 12, so he did not go interconference like a lot of these crazy college kids nowadays, but Quentin Grimes definitely made the right choice getting to Houston, playing for Kelvin Sampson, who really developed him as one of the top two-way stars when he ended up getting drafted. And even then, I mean, people didn't know if Quentin Grimes was going to make the Knicks roster. I know Knicks fans from day one loved Quentin Grimes. I can tell you that he was a hit right away. Even when he was balling in summer league and preseason, they wanted Grimes to be a part of the rotation. It took Tom Thibodeau quite a bit to finally fall on the Quentin Grimes train, and after a while, he earned his way into the rotation. Now he's on the Detroit Pistons. Who knows where his career will go from there? Because when you get to Detroit, anything can happen, and usually it's not good. I'm kind of not sure where I should put Quentin Grimes because I want to put him as a boom based on the fact that when he got drafted, no one was expecting that he could be an everyday player in the NBA, which is pretty much what he's turned into. But he's a top 10 2018 recruit. So technically you could say bust because usually they should be stars right now. I'm going to cheat and put him in the middle because I don't think it's fair to call him a boom or a bust. I think he is the perfect example of someone in the middle, a top 10 recruit who's making a living in the NBA.
Yeah, now moving on to number 9. I think this one, unfortunately, is pretty clear which side it should land on. This is E.J. Montgomery. He played for Kentucky for 2 seasons. I didn't know this. He's actually originally committed to Auburn, but when Bruce Pearl got hit with some NCAA violations, he flipped his commitment over to John Calipari. His first year, he only averaged just under 4 points for the Wildcats, but he was playing behind players like Reed Travis and P.J. Washington, so I think we can cut him a little bit of slack there, but he never really took that next leap. He only averaged 6 points in his sophomore year and eventually declared for the draft, went undrafted, spent a little bit of time in the G League before going to Lithuania, and he is now in Japan's top league for basketball. Yeah, unfortunately, this one just never did work out. He was considered a freak athlete, as I recall, heading out of high school and into college, but I don't know. It just never panned out for Montgomery. There were other players that jumped ahead of him. Like if Nate Sestina is getting minutes over you sometimes for Kentucky, maybe it's not the best idea to declare for the draft after just 2 years. But I think that, yeah, I just think it was sort of a lost college career for Montgomery. But hopefully he is, still finding ways to play basketball for the near future, whether it's in Japan or another international league.
Number 8, Anthony Simmons, a guy who was originally committed to Louisville, and then that whole scandal happened, and he was forced to obviously not play there, and he decided to just go directly pro. And I feel like I've somehow gotten a lot of the guys that have been involved in the scandals in this 2017 and 2018 episode, and most of them, I feel like for one reason or another didn't amount to much in their pro careers, but this guy's a exception, drafted 24th overall by Portland. He actually did take some time to break out. Wasn't great right away, but has been a phenomenal player in recent years. He got paid a few off seasons ago, 4 years, $100 million. And I'm thinking he might even warrant more given his performance recently in the next cycle. Once he becomes a free agent again, I'm absolutely calling him a boom.
Well, you move from an absolute boom to an absolute bust. That's Romeo Langford. Let's not forget, though, that like a couple guys on this list, Romeo Langford was certainly a star in college for the 1 year that he played in college at Indiana, was a top recruit. I mean, this was huge for Archie Miller when he was at Indiana. And Langford put up some big numbers with the Hoosiers. The problem is he gets drafted by the Celtics. They think they can maybe turn him into a little bit of a three-point shooter. And we've seen over the NBA career of Romeo Langford that whether as the 14th pick by the Celtics or with the San Antonio Spurs, there's a reason he's been in and out of the G League because he is less than a 30% career three-point shooter in the NBA. Guys, at 6'6", that just isn't going to cut it. I mean, this guy is expected to be able to shoot the basketball. He certainly scored at Indiana, but unfortunately, he just hasn't been able to add that second part to his game that you need. I mean, there is no excuse to be 6'6" and not be able to shoot in the NBA. Very few guys will make it in the league if they can't do that. And unfortunately for Romeo Langford, that's been the case for his career. But still, again, really good college player, but a clear bust on this list.
Yeah, moving on to number 6, Charles Bassey is a really interesting case because it's not often that you see a top 10 recruit head and sign with Western Kentucky. And he was very productive over his 3 years as a Hilltopper. He averaged a double-double in 2 of the 3 seasons, never averaged fewer than 11 and 9 in a season. But I do wonder if this is sort of like the turning point when for college recruiting rankings where it just at this point centers like Charles Bassey aren't as valuable in the NBA as they have been in the past, right? These aren't necessarily top 5 picks. You're not seeing Hunter Dickinson or Armando Bacot go number 1 overall anymore because that's just not how it's played in the league. And I think maybe this ranking is slightly inflated because of that. I think if you were talking about pure college production, yeah, he's definitely the number 6 overall recruit in the country based on what he did in college, right? Even though it was for a lower league. However, it just didn't really translate for the pros, or at least in the way that a star would like to have translated for the number 6 overall pick. He still is in the NBA. He just got his contract converted from a 2-way to a full-time contract with the San Antonio Spurs. He has a 4-year, $10.2 million contract. So he is in the league, which is more than can be said for a lot of players that we have talked about before. He has struggled with injuries a couple of times. He's recovering from a torn ACL right now. He had a torn patellar tendon the year before. But yeah, this is just sort of he doesn't necessarily fit the archetype of an NBA star at this point, given his play style. But he has, of course, found a spot in the league for him, and it'll be interesting to see whether he continues based on especially the injuries that we saw.
All right. Well, I've been waiting to talk about this guy for the entire episode. Zion Williamson. Obviously, overall a success story. He went to Duke and was the absolute just talk of the sport, brought fans pretty much like a lot of fans that only watched NBA and not college too much. They were just locked into regular season Duke basketball games because of Zion. And he was just one of the most electric one and done players in recent memory. Naismith Player of the Year, all the accolades he got. Then he was drafted first overall by the Pelicans. And anytime Zion has been on the court, he has been incredibly productive. The problem is he has battled a bunch of stuff, injuries, lower body injuries, specifically with his frame. People were questioning, even from his college days, whether it was sustainable to be built like that. And he also has battled, being a little bit overweight and out of shape and all that. But to the man's credit, he worked his way back. He basically played a full season this past season and he was, again, phenomenal. Anytime he's been on the court, he's been phenomenal. Unfortunately, he got banged up again in the play-in playoff game, but hopefully he could play some more full seasons on the court because he's electric and a very, very good player.
Yeah, it's too bad, too, because I think if Zion didn't get injured, there's a chance that the Pelicans do get out of the playing game because that one game that he was able to play in, he went off against, I believe it was the Lakers. I saw Zion, quick story, in high school, and that was a crazy thing to be a part of. I'd called some games for play-by-play at Springfield. They said, "Hey, here's some press passes. We know you do this stuff at CB Review. Why don't you check out the hoop hall?" Zion, RJ Barrett was there as well. A couple other guys, and yeah, that was one of the coolest atmospheres I've ever seen for a high school player. Even better than some college atmospheres. Like, that place was awesome. Speaking about guys though that were certainly the talk of the talk, because Bol was right there. Zion was like up here, but Bol was like, he was still like a pretty big talk when he was coming out. A 7'2" guy who could block shots, who could shoot threes. Only needed 1 year at Oregon, gets drafted, second round by the Heat, obviously ends up getting traded. And throughout his career, he's kind of just went around to a bunch of different teams. And you look at Bol, I think he's a bust, but the proof is there. The proof is in the pudding. He had this past year, he shot like 44% from three. Through his career, he shot about 33% from three. When you talk about a guy at his height who can even shoot 33%, but especially with that potential of being a 40% shooter from downtown. You see a guy who could stay in the NBA for a long time. For him, the concern has always been injury problems, and at that height and that weight, will he be able to be sustainable? Obviously, you talk about the injuries, but you even talk about how many minutes will he be able to play on the court per game. Bol certainly a talent. I've still got to go with a bust because you're the number 4 overall recruit, and you're not close to a household name if it wasn't for the fact that you're Bol. If you take that name out of the equation, people I don't think would really care too much. But he was Wemby before Wemby, if you want to go that far. He technically was Victor Wembanyama before Victor Wembanyama.
I don't know if I would go that far, but yeah, Bol is certainly one of the more interesting prospects, especially when you watched his whole draft room escapades, right? It was just, there was always something to watch with Bol, which is something I appreciated. Moving on to number 3, this is arguably the forgotten player of this top 5 is Nasir Little. So he was very, very good in high school. Like everyone was in on this dude. He was the first player since LeBron to have the MVP award in both high school All-American games, so the Jordan one and then the McDonald's one as well. He committed to play for North Carolina on a stacked team, and the numbers didn't necessarily show it all the time, but he was pretty good. He averaged just under 10 points, just under 6 rebounds on a team that included players like Cam Johnson, Kobe White, and Luke May. So this was a pretty stacked North Carolina team, given just the depth that they had overall. And then he went on to play. He was selected 25th overall by the Trailblazers, and was just on and off. He was a reserve piece basically his entire career, but everyone kept seeming to see some potential there. He eventually had an extension for just under $30 million. So really, he's proven that he can stick in the league. He just got traded to the Suns in the big DeAndre Ayton trade that sent Drew Holiday to the Celtics as well. So he's stuck in the league. For the number 3 overall pick, though, it is probably considered a bust, or the number 3 overall recruit, is probably considered a bust, just given the hype that he had coming into North Carolina. He left after 1 year. Maybe he could have used another one to polish up some stuff and avoid a pretty stacked draft class. But, that's just how it goes sometimes. And I don't think he's super unhappy with being able to stay in the league on a $30 million contract. So we'll see how it goes. We'll see if he reaches some potential. He's still only 24, so he has some time there as well.
All right, number 2, Cam Reddish. This was a guy who was included in that trio with Zion and RJ Barrett, who Matt will talk about in a sec, but I felt like he was always the third guy in that trio, like the clear number 3, even though he was number 2 overall recruit. Now, he did have some amount of college production. He was good in college. He was not great, in my opinion. And then he was drafted 10th overall by Atlanta, and it's just bounced around. Played for the Knicks for a little bit, Portland, now the Lakers, and he's shown flashes. Like, he's shown spurts of the reason why he was the number 2 overall recruit, but he hasn't been able to consistently get himself in the lineup. He hasn't been able to consistently produce, and I think having some sustained NBA career, if you're number 20 to 25 in the recruiting rankings early in this episode, that's perfectly fine, but as number 2 overall, I have to call him a bust.
I've got an interesting one with RJ Barrett. Let me remind you guys before anyone gets on me for this pick that I have RJ Barrett's Knicks jersey in my closet. I was a huge RJ Barrett fan. Nothing changed when he was traded. That hurt me a little bit. I didn't want to see RJ Barrett go. But you talk about a guy who's the number 1 overall recruit, spends 1 year at Duke, drafted by the Knicks, has a lot of good moments in New York, but really was never who New York wanted him to be. He got a huge contract with the Knicks, and he wasn't the guy that they needed. And it's pretty clear because they traded him and Emmanuel quickly and got OG Anunoby. You don't just trade someone who you think can be the star for OG Anunoby, someone who the Knicks now might even lose in free agency. And honestly, I don't think Knicks fans are even second guessing this because RJ Barrett just wasn't producing at the level that they needed him to. They needed him to probably be up at least 4 or 5 more points per game and produce a little more. So I'm going to call him a bust, which might sound crazy. But you look at his stats with Toronto. This is just with the Raptors. So mind you, this wasn't the full season, but a career high in rebounds and assists. He's putting up 21.8 points per game. He's certainly showing his potential with the Toronto Raptors. Also shot over 55% from the field. So for RJ Barrett, a scenery change might end up making him a boom. It's probably not fair for me to call him a bust, but you just look at the overall career, and obviously as a Knicks fan, I've watched like so many of these games, and you just know what the expectations of RJ Barrett were, and he did not meet those expectations. So maybe I'm calling it as a bust based on his tenure with the Knicks. His overall career, okay, he's a boom. He's not like there's been a lot worse players than RJ Barrett. But we're still waiting to see him take on what we know he's capable of, because you look at that skill set, this guy could be a 25 to 27 point per game scorer in the NBA. We just haven't seen that.
All right, and that does it for today's edition of the CBB Review Studio podcast. We might be back on the air in a couple days or even a couple hours, because we all woke up this morning with the Dan Hurley rumors and, him going potentially to the NBA for the LA Lakers and receiving some massive, massive contracts. So we're not going to talk about that yet because there's just so much up in the air, but just wanted to put that out there. I don't know if anything has happened in the last 45, 30 minutes since we've recorded. No, okay. But yeah, we'll be keeping you covered with that. Be sure to follow us on the socials and everything. And thanks for watching, and thanks for listening, and take care.